Great, thanks so much, Jim. So, the implementation gap. We weren't the first people to use this term. It's something that we've been seeing around. We've seen it from the Auditor General talking about it. We've seen Shelter Scotland talking about it in reference to homelessness, the Health Foundation in reference to health inequality, and even the First Minister himself talking about this challenge around delivery that the Scottish Government is seeing. So, the question we were asking is this just something we see across the Scottish body politic? If so, why? So we had a look at some big political priorities that have been happening in Scotland in the last decade or so. So things like the Promise, Curriculum for Excellence, closing the attainment gap, net zero, health inequalities and housing. And we tried to say, some of in those areas, the aims they laid out have not always been met. Is there something happening here that's sort of common throughout these pieces? So, two big questions. Number one, what is causing these problems? Are there some common themes that go across these different pieces? Number two, is there something particularly Scottish about them? I mean, obviously governments all over the world, just look at HS2, people are failing to do things that governments say they're going to do, but is there something particularly Scottish about here? So, to tackle that, we spoke to over 25 different experts in the field, so current and former politicians, people in the civil service and in delivery of public services, pulled through reports, pulled through committee hearings, to try to tackle these questions. So, what were our findings? So there were four big themes that we saw across all these different pieces. So, first of these, too much politics. 3 general elections, 2 Scottish elections, 2 big epoch-defining referenda. All of this means, more press conferences, more manifestos, more promises being made, and less time thinking about the actual delivery of these things. And the really important one of those was on the Constitution. This has been a campaign that's been running, felt like, for 10 years now, always just around the corner. And when you're in that kind of environment of sort of constantly campaigning of something always about to happen, this pretense that we're about to have a second referendum, you end up with, these constant sort of campaigning politics as well. So perhaps that's, it just means that when a politician is thinking about how to take the public with them, they're focusing on either side of the constitutional debate. So for the SNP and for the Conservatives in particular, that means that they can always rely on their kind of constitutional side of the argument, and all they need to do is make sure that they come out. And that actually acts to disincentivise, we found, taking some difficult decisions on things that might upset the base in the short term. Because if you're always on the cusp of having another referendum on such a big topic, if you see something controversial now, that might hit your polling, and it might hit the ultimate goal on the Constitution. So we found that both, on all sides of the constitutional divide, that kind of the damage of too much politics. Secondly, too much government. This chart here, you won't be able to see the numbers on it, but it basically presents the number of ministers and people in the Scottish Government over time. So you can see that Alex Salmond came in, he had a government of about 18 ministers and cabinet secretaries, and now we have 30 under Hamza Yousaf. And each of those ministers, they want to get in the press, they want to make sure they've got exciting things to announce, they've got things to put in the programme for government. And that means, there's only so many civil servants in the Scottish Government. So all these civil servants are split, between more and more ministers. More and more of these civil servants are worrying about having something interesting for their minister to say, or what's just been said about them on Twitter or whatever it might be. And this means there's fewer people there to actually deliver things, and fewer politicians in Parliament there on the government side, or on the SNP and the Greens in this case, able to sort of challenge some of their colleagues. So more people in government, fewer people to scrutinise them. We also found, it's something we heard across a lot of these things, a kind of addiction to sort of consultitis or strategy documentitis. And I was a former strategy consultant, so there's nothing wrong with strategies, I'm going to say that. But, there's been over 500 released in the last decade. That's like 1 a week, which is quite a lot of strategies. Many of those covering the exact same ground as previous ones. So a new minister comes in, they say, you know what, I'm going to put my stamp on this. So I know what's changed in 18 months, and I've got a really slightly different idea on this policy spin. So you've got these civil servants, rather than trying to deliver the previous person's work, you've got them trying to come up with a new strategy for the new minister. And consultations as well, same story, about 500 in the last decade, 1 a week. So sometimes it's easier to, it's consultation, it's great, get the community behind you, behind all these priorities, but if you're spending so much time talking to people and listening to people, there's not actually enough time to spend doing things. And so this consultitis is something that we've also found and kept coming up. Another piece is on the kind of the arms length bodies, the quangos, all those kinds of things. And many of them doing great work, but in a few of the cases, particularly Curriculum for Excellence comes to mind, you have them with slightly unclear, slightly overlapping briefs, and that just means that if no one's really accountable for these things, because lots of things seem to be accountable for it, then no one's actually going to be in charge and own up if things go wrong. So, perhaps there are too many of these things, or there's slightly overlapping priorities currently. So, too much government. One here basically focusing on the relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, big theme that comes across a lot of our work in our Scottish Future. And it's something that was pointed out in that Health Foundation report we cited at the top, but also on the Committee for Climate Change as well, basically saying, these are priorities, health inequality, net zero, all things which the UK Government and the Scottish Government, to at least an extent, want to address. So why aren't they working together properly on these things? And they're sort of making a play of the kind of conflict that they can bring out in those things, and there's political benefits to that, but actually we want these things to happen, so let's work together to make it happen. So I think a bit more cooperation and a bit less conflict would help in many of these cases. Lastly, centralising cautious culture. So we're not the first people to say that the Scottish Government has been fairly centralising over the last few years. And so you can pull this out from a quote from the Auditor General, but it just leaves a lot of local government feeling quite disempowered and kind of beholden to the whims of the centre, almost worried about the angry phone call from Holyrood if they do something that's a bit innovative or a bit risque. And that flows down into kind of a feeling of some hopelessness in the front line and in the sort of local government, where they're just sort of kowtowing to the will of the centre, and so you end up with this kind of decentralisation drives this kind of cautious culture or kind of conservative culture out in the front lines. And this sort of presidentialisation as well is something that just sort of even strengthens that further. So those are our four big themes, but it's important to say that it's not all bad. There's been some great achievements, with the devolved government. So whether it's on the Queensferry Crossing, National Manufacturing Institute, the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, and many more great examples of change that has been delivered by this government. But we have to emphasise that it's a real problem, this implementation gap, and it should be a huge political priority, because whatever other priorities you can come up with, if you can't actually do anything about them, then nothing is going to change. So surely the ability to do something, to achieve things, should be as important as what it is you're actually trying to do. And there should be a cross-party consensus on that, we feel. So when it came to thinking about what we should actually do about this, what are the solutions out there, the biggest one is, frankly, just one of political culture and leadership. A leader asking their ministers what that they said they were going to do last year, have they actually done, rather than what are they going to put into the new manifesto, or a government that is interested in telling the public about what it did last year and what it's achieved and what it's actually delivered, rather than what we're going to do for you in the future. So this kind of and that kind of change of leadership can then flow down through the rest of the system. But a change of leadership, a change of political culture is asking for a lot. It's a big change. So we have some more structural solutions as well. So in terms of government reform, we're proposing, we showed you that graph. I mean, I don't know if we can necessarily say that 30 people in the front bench is more effective than 18 people in the front bench. I'm not sure if we'd say that. So suggesting a cap on ministers. So it basically forces the government to be more focused, to choose fewer priorities, but just to do them more effectively and stop spreading the civil service so thinly. Also has a benefit from some savings, which we'll come to a bit later. We touched on sort of the issue with quangos and some of the overlapping responsibilities and those things, so just questioning whether which of them are being effective, which are not being effective. Is there a way to sort of delineate their responsibilities more clearly, so that rather than having 3 agencies responsible for education or whatever it might be, that it's really clear who's in charge of what. That kind of delivery culture, I've civil servants, many of whom have delivered great things, but perhaps we can incorporate a bit more external expertise in there as well. So people from the private sector or from the front line of public services, people not just with experience in developing policy, but also in actually operationalising some of these things. A duty to cooperate. So we touched on the relationship between the UK government and Westminster and Holyrood, but also across the local government as well. A duty to cooperate in these things, might be a slightly formalistic way of putting it, but by putting that in there, it can then flow through to a more cultural one. And then lastly, a couple of new institutions we suggested. So, First Ministerial Delivery Unit, sort of slightly inspired by Barbara's one, to help help the centre track its progress on the things it says are the most important to it. And then a more powerful Scottish financial ministry, so giving the Treasury more powers to scrutinise spending lines and to check that when a minister is making a pledge on, we're going to spend 100 million on this thing, actually half of it's just kind of earmarked from slightly other pots, and make big promises can sound really great. But if you say you're going to do 100 million pounds worth of stuff, and you only got 50 million pounds worth of money, then funnily enough, you only end up actually achieving 50 million pounds worth of stuff. So there's no wonder when you're kind of not really associating money with some of these priorities that they don't actually happen. So a few things there, but those last ones, you could see as slightly risking some centralisation. But so we want to build in some scrutiny into the system as well. So this is where furthering democracy is important, to creating some external bodies to challenge the government on its delivery and its priorities. So, as in Wales, a Future Generations Commissioner, accountable to the Parliament rather than to the government, to look at those long-term goals, whether it's on climate change or the attainment gap or whatever it might be, and to say, you said you're going to do these things, are these things actually happening? Here are some ideas that are being seen elsewhere, and challenging the government where it's making short-term decisions. Rewiring Scotland, so this is a teaser for a forthcoming Our Scottish Future report, so stay tuned for that. This is all about how we can rejig sort of within Scotland how local government works with agencies and communities to empower the front line, and basically try and eradicate that sense of despondency that we felt in our interviews and in the rest of our work. The last two of these are about Scottish Parliament committees. So there were some reforms in the Westminster Select Committees a decade or so ago that have helped to make them a sort of stronger bastion for independent thought. And so we suggest electing the membership of those committees rather than having them appointed by the leadership of the parties, so being another kind of bit of patronage for the leadership. And getting some more independent voices in there, but also incentivising people, some of the serious independent-minded backbenchers, to take these roles by offering some money to the conveners of those committees and using some of the money that we save from the cap on the ministers. So those are the suggestions we've got for now. We'll leave you on this slide, which is basically a bit of a cultural checklist for a First Minister or anyone else who's interested in trying to address some of those four thematic problems that we saw. I'm not going to go through them now, but you can see them there. And if the First Minister wants to really change these things and turn Scotland into a place that they can get things done once more, then taking this checklist as a starting point would we think be a big help. So thank you. That's all for now. But I'll pass back to Jim.